In this edition of 1+1, Senior Counsel for the Black Saturday Royal Commission and his concerns with the final report. Hello, I'm Jane Hutchin. Welcome to the program. As those affected by Australia's worst bushfire disaster absorbed the contents of the Royal Commission report released a fortnight ago, the lawyer who led the inquiry says the final document could have been more significant. Jack Rush QC spoke to Jane Cowan about his views on the firestorms, the evidence and the Commissioner's final analysis in this exclusive interview.
Jack Rush, welcome to 1+1.
Thank you.
If there was one thing that you wanted out of this inquiry, it was clearly for the stay-or-go policy to be done away with. You argued for it to be completely scrapped in all its forms. You must be disappointed that the Commissioners haven't gone that far.
That was one thing. I think, again, warnings was critically important. I don't think you can divorce the two. We, in our submissions, Council assisting, made very strong recommendations based on the evidence that the stay-or-go policy was fundamentally flawed, and that it was never ever going to, the stay-or-go policy, having regard to the way in which communities will react, was not a policy that was the way forward. Now, that's our position, and it needs to be recognised that was Council assisting's position, and the Commissioners are the people that had to make the decision.
Why were you so convinced that the policy needed to go?
At a very early stage, I don't think Joan Davey would mind me mentioning her name or her family's name. We heard from both sides of the family, but there was a family in Baldspur Road, Kinglake, who had done absolutely everything to comply with that policy. A family that initially were not going to stay, but in the end chose to adopt the stay-or-go policy and stay and defend their home. From putting in sprinkler systems, to clearing, to being alert on the day, to being outside and looking for smoke, to Mrs Davey being inside, checking the computer and checking the internet. Everything about that was a family that complied with the stay-or-go policy. And yet, I think one of the most awkward moments of Council assisting in that Royal Commission was to hear a 10-minute phone call when that household phoned 000 as the fire was consuming their house. And I think all of that put together was enough to convince me that the stay-or-go policy and the decisions that are required of people to comply with it, but more particularly the efforts that are required of untrained people to fight fire, that we needed to have a look at it. We needed to reconsider it, and we really needed to ensure that that was not the basis of a bushfire policy in the future.
Did you see the key failure on Black Saturday as having much to do with that individual level of responsibility, or did you see it as the system level? No,
I definitely did not see it as anything to do with individual responsibility. I think, of course, you might get isolated incidents where people are foolish or silly, but as in the general, the great weight of evidence clearly demonstrated that responsible people were making decisions on what they were being informed. Responsible people were listening to the radio, had heard what the Premier and everyone else had said leading up to the 7th of February, were going to the internet, were keeping an eye on things. But when people are being informed that there's a fire at Kilmore, when it's 25 kilometres away from Kilmore, then their decision making is based on what's at Kilmore, what is not, or what on what is 5 kilometres away. That was the critical failures.
You argued that stay-or-go should be replaced with a system that had voluntary evacuation as the primary response to bushfire. The Commissioners haven't picked that up, although voluntary evacuation is in there as an option. Why did you think voluntary evacuation could work in Australia as it does in America?
Look, can I say the Commissioners have picked up voluntary evacuation, so I think that's a very important aspect, and it's based on, again, information and advice being given to communities. The evidence that was called from America, and there's clearly been a lot of conjecture about whether what occurs in California can apply in Australia and apply in Victoria. I think the evidence was overwhelming that it can apply in Victoria. It requires a concerted community effort to ensure that it is conducted effectively and properly. And we need to recognise that in any fire situation there is always going to be an element of risk, whatever the policy. But here I was sure on the great body of evidence that was introduced that voluntary evacuation was a policy that could work in Australia as it works in the United States.
One of the problems with the stay-or-go policy that the evidence has shown is that it tends to run counter to human nature, that people, no matter how many times you tell them, will not leave early. To what extent do you think that problem has been addressed by what has been recommended?
Look, I think I've got to be careful in relation to what I say about the recommendations and the report. But that said, I think it needs to be well understood. It was understood on the 7th of February 2009 that people would not leave early. That is not a common sense approach to bushfire. I know you just know, and the research since the 7th of February shows that people are going to wait and see. That is the response. Is there a fire in our area? Then what do we do? And that's the nature of the human condition. It was well addressed by Professor Leonard from Harvard, who indicated this isn't a policy at all because people take no notice of it. And I think, from my perspective, that is not going to change. If it hasn't changed within a year of the 7th of February, then whatever we do, after all the education that's gone to the stay-or-go policy, I think we have to adopt a policy, and I think the commissioners have headed in this direction, towards an understanding that the vast majority of people, my recollection is over 70% of people, are not going to move until they know there's a fire in their area.
What hope do you have that things will change?
Oh, look, I'm sure things will change as a consequence of the Commissioner's report and recommendation. I should say that one could be excused for thinking that many of the recommendations, and particularly the important recommendations such as warnings, may not be implemented after report after report highlighting the importance of it. But that said, and even with that history, I have great confidence that these recommendations will be implemented. If for no other reason, I don't think government or fire organisations can be left in a position of not implementing these recommendations when they, without implementation, they potentially face the same sort of catastrophe. So a legacy for government or a legacy for a fire leader, I think, will be to introduce these recommendations over time to avoid as best we can the sort of events that occurred on the 7th of February.
It's obvious that this has meant a lot to you. Did you make a deliberate decision to be so accessible to the families who had lost loved ones? Because you didn't necessarily have to be.
Can I say firstly that Council Assisting worked as a team throughout, and each member of our team was affected by the evidence that was given, and I think I speak for all the legal team that was involved, that you can't walk away from something like that and not be affected. You can't deal with people that have suffered so enormously and continue to suffer so enormously without being affected. And funnily enough, when the adrenaline stops pumping and you sit back and start to go over things and think through things, it very much stays with you. But generally, I hope for the good, because I think the overall experience of dealing with people has been a very good one.
Jack Rash, thanks very much for talking to the ABC.
Thanks, Joe.